When you think of Bhutan, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably that famous gross national happiness index, right? It sounds like a perfect place, but there's a whole other side to that story, a much darker one that almost never gets told. And that's what we're going to dive into today. A story about what it's like to have your childhood stolen and spent in exile. I want you to meet Deepa. At just 3 years old, a joint team from Bhutan and Nepal officially declared her a criminal. A criminal. And her story, as shocking as it is, isn't a one-off. It's the story of thousands upon thousands of kids who grew up without a country, stuck in refugee camps, labeled as criminals by the very nation their parents and grandparents called home. It's just mind-boggling. So the big question is, how on earth does this happen? How does a toddler become a criminal in her own country? To get to the bottom of that, we have to go back a bit. We need to unpack this whole tangled story of power, of identity, and a political fight that really kicked off back in the late 1980s.
Right, so let's set the stage. This whole crisis, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It really started brewing because a movement began to grow. A movement of people who dared to stand up and question the absolute power of the king. They were asking for democratic reforms, and that was a very dangerous thing to do.
So you had these groups of activists popping up. We're talking teachers, students, regular folks, intellectuals, all starting to organize. They created groups like the People's Forum for Human Rights. And what they were asking for wasn't exactly radical stuff, They wanted basic freedoms, a constitutional monarchy, a more democratic way of doing things. But that call for change, it was met with, let's just say it was met with some serious, immediate pushback. And when I say pushback, I mean it. The government's reaction was incredibly fast and absolutely brutal. We're talking weeks, and key activists were already being arrested. Some were even nabbed in neighboring Nepal and sent back to Bhutan. They tried to be formal about it. They sent a 7-point memo to the king asking for basic things like free speech and representation, and it was completely ignored. Instead, the king just imposed army rule. And that's when things spiraled into a massive human rights crisis that forced thousands upon thousands of people to literally run for their lives. Now, for all those thousands of people who fled, they probably thought this would be temporary, a few months, maybe a year. But it wasn't. Exile became their life. It turned into a life sentence, stuck in these refugee camps, just trapped in this horrible limbo, always waiting to go home. But that day just never seemed to come. And look, they tried everything. They exhausted every peaceful option you can think of. For years, you had these talks between Bhutan and Nepal, but they always hit a wall, because Bhutan just wouldn't admit that most of these people were its citizens. They launched international campaigns, they held peaceful marches, they even got resolutions passed in the European Parliament. And after all that, nothing. The Bhutanese government just would not move an inch. It's just this incredibly heartbreaking cycle, right? You can just picture it. The refugees would get their hopes up. They'd organize a peaceful march or send another appeal, thinking this time someone will listen. And every single time, instead of a conversation, they were met with the army. Hope would rise, only to be crushed by military force, over and over and over. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why was the government so completely unwilling to find some middle ground? Well, the answer really goes back to the history of the monarchy itself. It all comes down to its deep-seated fear of any challenge to its absolute total power. So a quick history lesson. Before 1907, Bhutan wasn't even a monarchy. It was a theocracy. It was led by a really revered religious figure called the Shabdrung. But then, with a little help from the British, the Wangchuck dynasty came in and established a monarchy, basically grabbing all the power for themselves. And right from the get-go, this new royal family was super wary of two big threats: the old religious authority they had replaced and this newfangled idea of democracy.
And let's be clear, the monarchy has a pretty dark history when it comes to dealing with rivals. Over the years, several reincarnations of that religious ruler, the Shabdrung, ended up either assassinated or dying under really mysterious circumstances, usually right after they challenged the king's power. Even the current child Shabdrung was basically taken by the government and now lives under severe restrictions. So when you see that pattern of suppressing any challenge, the reaction to the pro-democracy movement, it starts to make a chilling kind of sense.
And then there were the promises. Oh, the promises. Get this. Back in 1992, the king actually went on record and promised to step down, to abdicate, if he couldn't solve this whole refugee problem in 3 years. 3 years.
He ended up staying on the throne for another 14 years after that, and finally left in 2006 with the crisis just as bad as it ever was. Okay, so fast forward. After almost 20 years of broken promises and getting absolutely nowhere, you can imagine what was happening in those camps. Something had to give. Patience was just gone. Hope was fading fast. And a whole new generation, kids who were born in exile and knew nothing else, they started to think, you know what? This peaceful protest stuff, it's not working.
And at the same time, life in the camps was getting tougher and tougher. International aid started drying up. It's something they call donor fatigue. So suddenly you've got this full-blown humanitarian crisis on your hands. There are food shortages, the shelters are falling apart, and the healthcare and education systems are basically collapsing. For a generation of kids who'd never seen the outside world, this was all they had, and it was falling apart.
And that was the tipping point. After 2 decades of getting nowhere with diplomacy and watching their lives get worse, a group of young, incredibly frustrated refugees just said, enough. Peace has failed. So they formed the Communist Party of Bhutan and made a decision that would change everything. They decided to take up arms. The movement was no longer about peaceful protest. It was now an armed struggle.
The stakes here, they just couldn't be any higher. This number you're seeing, over 13,000, that's how many people died during the Maoist People's War right next door in Nepal. That is a terrifying, terrifying precedent. It's a huge, grim warning of what could happen, the sheer human cost, if Bhutan goes down that same violent path.
So this brings us up to a pivotal moment, 2006. The old king finally steps down and he passes the crown to his son. And for a second, there was this little spark of hope. Maybe a new king would mean a new approach. But even with a new face on the throne, the core problem, it was still there, completely unsolved. And the contrast here is just, it's brutal. You have these two completely different realities for Bhutanese kids. Inside Bhutan, you see pictures of the new, young king sharing his grand vision with the country's children. And then, just across the border, you have another generation of Bhutanese children, kids in refugee camps, who aren't dreaming of a grand vision. They're just hoping someone, anyone, will rescue them from this nightmare.
You know, there's a quote from an activist that just hits the nail on the head. The frustration is very high. The earlier that we find a solution, better will be the future of these youth. And that's exactly it. The frustration is boiling over. And the real fear is that if a solution isn't found, and found soon, all that youthful energy is going to turn destructive. Their whole future is literally hanging in the balance.
And so that leaves us right here with this one massive unanswered question. Is the new king going to be like his father, just kicking the can down the road year after year? Or is he going to be the one to finally step up and take real action to end this crisis that's been going on for decades?
And we have to remember, for Deepa, that little girl who was labeled a criminal when she was just 3, and for thousands and thousands of others just like her, this isn't some abstract political issue. This is their life. Their entire existence has been spent waiting and watching from inside a refugee camp, clinging to the one hope that maybe, just maybe, one day, they'll finally get to go home.